and welcome to my channel. My fascination with cryptids began a few years ago when I was on vacation listening to my cousin tell stories about Bigfoot and Dogman. I started listening to and reading every story I could find about every type of cryptid. This led to me starting this channel so I could read these stories I find so fascinating. In this episode, I share 4 menacing encounters with unknown cryptids. If you are a hardcore believer, a skeptic with an open mind, or a non-believer, you are welcome here. I just ask that you keep it respectful in the comment section. No one should be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Alright, now let's get to today's stories. Our first story comes from a poster who had a genuinely terrifying experience with an unknown cryptid. She doesn't say where she lives specifically, just that the encounter happened in Western Germany. It was late one night in October in our OP-laden bed, which was in the corner of her bedroom right beside the window. Her home is in a rural area near forests and mountains. The house is small, has a flat roof, and is surrounded by a garden. She usually sleeps with her window open. The strange events on this night started with her hearing a horrible screaming from somewhere out in the night that sounded like a woman in agony but felt distorted. She felt as if it cut to her very core, sending a cold chill up her spine. She has since compared it to every type of animal from records at zoology institutes, but nothing even comes close to replicating that dreadful scream. First, there was only one scream. Then it sounded as if there were 2 creatures screaming in the area surrounding her home. Whatever it was close, too close for comfort. The screaming eventually stopped, but then she heard footsteps running in her garden right below her window. This was followed by the sound of branches breaking at the same height as her window, which was on the 2nd floor. Just after hearing the branches break, there was a loud whoosh of air before she heard something land on her roof right above her. Whatever it was made a heavy thud when it landed. It sounded massive. There were no animals in the area that big. The being then began running from one side of her roof to the other, the footfalls pounding back and forth. When it first started running, it sounded as if it was on 2 legs, but then she thought she heard the creature running on all 4s. She sat straight up in bed, directly under this thing, her heart pounding, trying to process what was happening and what could possibly be on her roof making this kind of racket. She suddenly felt uneasy, as if this thing had malicious intent. She had no way of fighting this thing off should it try to get into her home, so she did the only thing she could think of. She reached up and smacked the window as hard as she could, trying to scare this creature away. What happened next still fills her with dread to this day. After striking the window, but before she could even bring her arm back down, this thing reached down and hit the window from the outside, reacting with incredible speed. She guessed then that it must have been sitting right above her window. The whole situation was so surreal. What hit the outside of her window sounded like, to her, big claws mixed with feathers. She sat there on the brink of shock, realizing in that moment that she was powerless against this thing. She knew it was incredibly big, intelligent, and would not back down. She pushed her back against the wall, sitting on her bed, frozen in fear, too scared to even breathe. She couldn't even bring herself to close the window. That's when the creature suddenly jumped off the roof with another whoosh in the air and disappeared into the night. She still doesn't know what was on her roof that night, but does mention another user's encounter in Germany, detailing how he and his friend were out hunting when they heard a scream she says is the exact same thing she heard, at least described by this other user. The 2 men were then chased by the creature, which they didn't get a good look at. I've got to admit that this one is a mystery to me. I don't have a clue what this poor girl encountered on her roof and right outside her window. Luckily though, it left without further incident. What do you think it could have been? Our next story is from a poster who lives in Utah. He is an avid camper and has gone on many camping trips into the Utah deserts without incident. That is, until about a year ago when an unwanted, unwelcome, malicious visitor entered his camp late one night. Our OP says that while always interested in cryptids and creepy stories, he has always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. His encounter happened on a camping trip with his 3 brothers. They had ventured out into the Utah deserts and set up camp near the lava tubes. These particular lava tubes are near Fillmore, Utah, where a volcano erupted thousands of years ago but left a lasting impression on the landscape that persists today. There are miles of lava fields, craters, and tubes or caves carved out by the flowing of lava underground. Some of these tubes extend miles underground, while others are smaller and not fully enclosed. People come from all over to hike, explore, and camp in the area. Our OP's story begins with him and his 3 brothers setting out for a one-night camping trip to the lava tubes near Fillmore, where they set up a camp pretty far away from the dirt road leading to the area. They were the only ones in the area that night and had a nice evening hanging out and spending some quality time together talking, looking at the stars, and watching a movie before going to bed. They all stayed in the same 4-man tent. All of his brothers fell asleep in short order, but he just couldn't get to sleep for some reason. He lay there for about an hour and a half listening to coyotes howl out in the desert. Midnight had come and gone and our OP was still wide awake. It was around 12:30 or 1 o'clock in the morning when a feeling of dread suddenly came over him. His hairs stood on end and he got a sinking feeling in his gut. That's when he heard the footsteps coming toward camp. The heavy footfalls of something big that sounded bipedal. He lay there listening to the footsteps as they approached, sliding through the grass, disrupting the stones, walking right up to the tent where it stopped. Then a high-pitched, shrill whistle cut through the silence. It was otherworldly and unnerving, one of those chilling, eerie noises that made your skin crawl. Our OP stiffened at the sound, his heart beating at a rapid pace. The sinister, hollow noise seemed to pierce through to his very soul, paralyzing him in fear. He lay there listening, waiting, until he heard this thing start to walk slowly away from the tent with the same heavy footfalls he heard before. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the distance and the unwelcome visitor was gone. The OP says that the fear that overcame him that night was unlike any fear he had ever experienced. He couldn't even bring himself to peek out of the tent, even as he knew this thing, whatever it was, walked away. He laid awake for another hour, trying to decide if he should wake his brothers up, but decided not to disturb them and try to get some sleep. The next morning, he told them what happened as they packed up camp, but none of his brothers believed him. That is, until they got home and their dad told them something that shook them at their very core. He told his boys that the previous night at around 12:30 a.m., a feeling of intense unease came over him and he was very worried about them. He could not say why, but he felt as if they were in extreme danger and he needed to pray for their safety, which he did not hesitate to do. The OP's brothers were much more inclined to believe his story after hearing this. I've heard stories where family members have felt the sudden need to pray for their loved ones because they somehow knew they were in a dangerous situation. Whatever or whoever came into their camp that night and stood outside the tent seemed evil and like it had malicious intent. At least that's what I gather from how the OP describes the encounter and the primal fear instilled in him by this thing. But for whatever reason, it just turned and walked away. At the same time, the father was praying for his son's safety. It doesn't seem like a coincidence. What do you think it was that came into their camp that night? Our next story comes from a poster who lives in a small town in Oregon. His family's property is surrounded by a forest that isn't particularly dense, and he has neighbors that live relatively close, but still kind of far away. The entrance to the property has a gate that is approximately 150 feet away from his house. Our OP already doesn't like going outside at night because he and certain family members have heard voices, sometimes sounding familiar, calling to them from the darkest part of the property. They have 4 cameras on their property, but the voices are always heard from the blind spot amongst these cameras. Our OP has had a first-hand experience of something calling out to him, which he feels is an attempt to lure him into the darkness. One evening, his mom asked him to go out to close the gate, but it was already dark out. He was extremely hesitant, but with some more prodding from his mother, he hustled down to the front of the property to close the gate. He did so without incident and made it back to the house. He was irritated with his mom for making him go out there alone, so he decided to vent to a friend of his about what happened and why he was so reluctant to go outside. There have been 4 instances where someone heard something calling to them in the darkness, mimicking a familiar voice to try to lure them away from the house. Apparently, his mom doesn't believe him or, like his friend, doesn't believe in that kind of thing, but that would all change during the night. Our OP went to bed and woke up the next morning, seeking out his sister to vent to her because she has heard voices too. That is when she told him that their mother experienced something the night before. During the night, she goes outside to smoke. The previous night, while she was standing out there, she heard her daughter calling to her from the darkest part of the property. Whatever it was trying to lure her out into the darkness. This has happened to his sister on 2 different occasions when she has been outside at night, and she has also heard heavy footsteps on the roof. There are several kinds of cryptids that are said to be able to mimic the voices of others, even voices of family members and friends, using them to try and lure people into the woods. But in this instance, into an area of the yard that has no light and is away from the cameras. Almost as if whatever's out there knows where the cameras are and what parts of the yard they cover. The 2 cryptids that first come to mind when I hear this story are the Wendigo and Skinwalker. But it is said, and I have heard in stories, that the Sasquatch can mimic voices too. There really isn't enough to go on to say what is outside this family's home trying to lure them out into the darkness. Do you think it could be a Wendigo or a Skinwalker? Maybe a Sasquatch? Or is it something else entirely? Our final story comes from Tennessee and involves something else calling out from the darkness, mimicking familiar voices. The poster says she lives close to Bean Station, a small town in Tennessee, with a population of right around 3,000 people. The town was founded in 1777 and named after William Bean. The region where the town resides was once considered a major crossroad along the route from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. The OP says she and her husband live in a rural area, that her home is surrounded by farmland, and the nearest grocery store is approximately 20 miles away. The area where she and her husband live is supposedly haunted, and they live, from what she has heard, on an Indian burial ground. They have a garden behind their home that she goes out to water at night. While tending to her garden, she routinely hears strange noises coming from the field behind her home. She has heard a woman screaming, someone calling out to her saying, "Hey!" and she has even heard her own mother's voice calling out her name. Several times her husband has also heard voices calling out his name. One night, their dog started going crazy, barking aggressively and growling at something outside. Her husband went out to see if he could figure out what the dog was so upset about when he heard what sounded like a crying baby coming from the field. But it did not sound normal, and definitely did not sound human. It was strange and distorted. He went back inside and they both went out a little later to see if they could hear the noise, but it had stopped. She has no idea what could be making these noises or what's going on around her home. Her husband, who is half Cherokee, believes that the sounds could be coming from a Wendigo or a Skinwalker. Our OP turned to the online community for help because she feels whatever this thing is growing more ambitious and is getting braver, coming closer to the house. She would love to be able to write the sounds off as a mountain lion or some other kind of animal, but knows that this is not an animal that they are dealing with because they have heard distinct voices calling out their names many times. Lending credence to the fact that it isn't an animal were footprints that she found in the snow one morning in her backyard. The prints were deep, about a foot long, and had the toe of what looked like a goat hoof and the heel of a high-heeled shoe. Commenters from the area have weighed in, sharing their accounts of strange things that they've also experienced. They have also heard voices calling out to them, and one group experienced the heavy running footsteps of a large creature running through the woods just before it said "hey" in a raspy voice. There have also been reports of Bigfoot and Dogman sightings in the area, as well as a large winged creature. This area of Tennessee seems to be a hotbed for paranormal and supernatural activity. Again, the mimicking of familiar voices and sounds of a crying baby give me a few ideas of what this might be, but the footprints in the snow? That has me stumped. What do you think could have made footprints like that? Anyone from Eastern Tennessee want to weigh in? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put my email in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an upcoming episode. Please just make sure that it is well written, uses punctuation, and is proofread. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.